The bathroom was my safe haven, a spot where I could duck away from the madness of the day and lose myself in the calming rhythm of the shower. The hot water poured over me, loosening the knots in my muscles and filling the room with steam. The mirror fogged up, and the air was heavy with the smell of my lavender body wash. I tilted my head back, letting the water run over my face, my mind wandering to the boring chores waiting for me once I got out. Narrator comment: you know, sometimes it's the little moments like these that keep you sane. But hey, don't forget to drop a comment below if you've ever had one of those me time moments interrupted. And hey, hit that like button and subscribe if you're into this kind of stuff. I didn't hear the soft creak of the door opening, the sound drowned out by the steady rush of water. I also didn't notice the slight change in the air as Ethan, my stepson, slipped inside. He was supposed to be out with friends, or at least that's what I thought. But there he was, standing just inside the doorway, his eyes wide as he stared at my shadow behind the frosted glass of the shower door. At first, I was completely unaware, humming quietly to myself as I soaped up my arms. But when I turned to rinse off, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. My heart nearly stopped when I realized he was there, his hand moving under the waistband of his pants, his arousal obvious. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat, my brain scrambling to process what was happening. For a second, we just stared at each other, the steam swirling around us, making the whole thing feel unreal, like some kind of twisted dream. I could see the guilt in his eyes, but there was something else too, something raw and unspoken. His breathing was shallow, his face flushed, and I could tell he was just as stunned as I was that he'd been caught. My first thought was to yell at him, to tell him to get out right then and there. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, his gaze a mix of shame and want. Or maybe it was that tiny, unexpected spark I felt deep down. Something I didn't want to admit was there. Whatever it was, I stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch out, the tension between us growing thicker by the second. Finally, he was the one to break the silence. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely louder than the sound of the water. He spun around and bolted out of the bathroom, the door shutting softly behind him. The click of the latch seemed to echo in the quiet, leaving me standing there under the water, my heart racing. For a long time, I just stood there, the water pounding down on me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My head was spinning with emotions, shock, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was nothing, just a dumb teenage moment he'd forget about soon enough. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something about the way he'd looked at me, something that stuck in my mind long after I turned off the water and stepped out of the shower. I wrapped myself in a towel, moving slowly, trying to steady my thoughts. The mirror was still fogged, and I wiped it clear with my hand, staring at my reflection. My cheeks were flushed, my eyes wide and unsure. I took a deep breath, trying to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me like the steam still hanging in the air. As I left the bathroom and headed back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed in a way I couldn't take back. I told myself it was just a moment, a blip in the rhythm of our lives that would fade with time. But as I sat on the edge of my bed, still wrapped in the towel, the image of him standing there, his hand moving under his pants, played over and over in my mind. It wasn't just the shock of the moment that stayed with me, it was the look in his eyes, the way he'd looked at me like I was something he wanted. I ran my hands over my body, the towel slipping a little as I did. My skin was still damp, and the cool air made me shiver. I thought about the way Ethan's breath had caught, the way his hand had moved under his waistband. I shouldn't have felt flattered. I shouldn't have felt anything at all. But I did. It was wrong, I knew that. But the truth was, it felt good to be seen, to be wanted. It had been months since I'd felt truly desired. My husband, Ryan, and I had fallen into a predictable routine, and intimacy had become something we scheduled rather than something that happened naturally. I missed the warmth of a touch, the thrill of being wanted. And as much as I hated to admit it, the look in Ethan's eyes had stirred something in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. This wasn't right. Ethan was my stepson. I had to remember that. But as I finally got dressed and climbed into bed, the sheets cool against my skin, the image of him standing there, his eyes dark with something I didn't want to name, stayed with me. Sleep took forever to come, and when it did, it was restless, filled with dreams that left me waking up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding and my skin hot. In the days after the bathroom incident, I couldn't shake the memory of Ethan's eyes, his hand moving under his waistband, the way he'd frozen when he realized I'd caught him. It lingered in my mind, a flicker of heat I couldn't put out. I told myself it was nothing, just a dumb teenage impulse. But the truth was, it had stirred something in me too, something I wasn't ready to face yet. I couldn't help but notice how he avoided eye contact with me, how his cheeks turned red whenever I walked into the room. It was like the air between us had shifted, charged with a tension I hadn't seen coming. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself to act normal, to pretend nothing had happened. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it seemed to pull me in. It was like a game I wasn't sure I wanted to play but couldn't resist. And so, little by little, I started testing the boundaries. It began one morning in the kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the counters as I made coffee. Ethan was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, his posture relaxed but his shoulders slightly tense. I could feel his awareness of me, the way his eyes flicked up whenever I moved. When I needed a cup from the cabinet above him, I leaned over him on purpose, letting my body brush against his shoulder. My shirt was loose, dipping a little as I reached, and I noticed the way his breath hitched. "Oops," I said softly, my voice light and teasing. I glanced down at him, catching the way his eyes darted away as soon as they met mine. His cheeks turned pink, and I couldn't help but smile. "Need anything else, sweetheart?" I asked, my tone innocent but laced with something else, something that made his face flush even deeper. He mumbled something I couldn't make out, his phone slipping from his hands as he fumbled for words. I turned away, hiding my smile as I poured my coffee. It was a small thing, just a brush of contact, but I could feel the tension between us crackle. The thrill of it was undeniable, the way I could make him react with just the tiniest hint of attention. Over the next few days, the teasing became more intentional. I started seeking out moments to be near him, using casual touches and playful comments to see how far I could push things. One afternoon, we were standing side by side at the sink, washing dishes. I leaned in closer than necessary, my arm brushing against his. He tensed, his hand freezing under the water, and I couldn't resist murmuring, "You're being awfully quiet today. Something on your mind?" He didn't answer, but I could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers gripped the plate he was holding just a little too hard. I stepped back, letting him feel the absence of my presence, and noticed how his shoulders seemed to sag, not in relief, but something else. It fascinated me, how easily I could affect him. And I couldn't resist doing it again. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I caught him staring at me from across the room. I was bending over to pick something up off the floor, and I could see the way his eyes lingered for just a second too long. Our eyes met, and instead of looking away like I usually would, I held his gaze, a small smile playing on my lips. "You know," I said, my voice low and teasing, "if you're going to stare, you might as well come closer." His eyes widened, and he quickly turned away, muttering something about needing to take out the trash. I laughed softly, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop myself. There was something intoxicating about the way he reacted to me, the way his breath hitched and his face flushed at the smallest hint of attention. The teasing became a game, one I couldn't resist playing. One morning, as we stood together in the kitchen again, I decided to push a little further. I was making breakfast, and he was standing nearby, pretending to be engrossed in his phone. I was wearing a cozy sweater, and I knew the way it hugged my figure was hard to ignore. The cool air made my nipples slightly hard, and I could see the way his eyes flicked toward me before he quickly looked away. I reached for the butter in the fridge, letting my hand brush against his as I did. He froze, his eyes snapping to mine, and I leaned in slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Next time, maybe you should come in." His face turned bright red, and he stammered something I couldn't quite catch. I giggled softly, the sound light and teasing, and turned back to the stove. I could feel his eyes on me, though, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. It was a dangerous game I was playing, but I couldn't help myself. The power I felt in those moments was addictive, the way he hung on my every word and touch. Yet, as much as I enjoyed the control, there was something else brewing beneath the surface. The way I felt when I was near him, the way my heart raced when he looked at me with those dark, intense eyes, it was something I hadn't felt in a long time. It scared me, but it also excited me, and I wasn't ready to let it go. One evening, after a long day, I decided to take a shower to unwind. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that made me feel like the only person awake. I wrapped myself in a towel, the soft fabric barely clinging to my damp skin, and headed toward the bathroom. But as I passed Ethan's room, I remembered I'd left something in there earlier, maybe my hairbrush or lotion, I wasn't sure. I thought it wouldn't hurt to check. I pushed the door open and stepped inside without knocking. Ethan was sitting on his bed, his phone in hand, but he quickly looked up when he saw me. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of me standing there in nothing but a towel, my hair still damp from the shower. I didn't miss the way his gaze flickered over me, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Sorry, I said, my voice soft and apologetic but laced with a hint of something else, playfulness. I think I left something in here earlier. He nodded, his eyes dropping to his phone as if he couldn't trust himself to look at me for too long. I pretended not to notice, though I couldn't help but feel a small thrill at the way he reacted. I moved toward the dresser, my bare feet padding softly against the floor as I bent over to search for what I was looking for. The towel slipped slightly, and I felt it begin to fall. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as the fabric pooled at my feet, leaving me completely exposed. For a moment, the room was utterly still. I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, his shock palpable in the air. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, but there was something else too, a strange, unexpected thrill that made my stomach flutter. I turned to face him, my hands instinctively moving to cover myself, but I didn't rush to pick up the towel. His eyes were wide, his face flushed, and I could see the struggle in his expression, the conflict between guilt and desire. He scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy as he grabbed the towel and moved toward me. "Here," he muttered, his voice hoarse as he wrapped the towel around me. His hands trembled slightly as they brushed against my skin, and his touch lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. I couldn't help but notice the way his breath hitched when our eyes met. I reached up to hold the towel in place, my fingers brushing against his as I did. The air between us was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. I could see the way he was struggling to look at me, the way his gaze kept flickering to mine before darting away. But I didn't let him look away. I held his gaze, my voice soft and low as I whispered, "Why don't you join me in the shower?" His eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought he might protest, might say something about how wrong this was, how we shouldn't. But instead, he nodded, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he swallowed hard. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire warring with his guilt, but I didn't give him a chance to change his mind. I reached for his hand, my fingers intertwining with his as I led him toward the bathroom. The hallway felt impossibly long, every step stretching out as if time itself had slowed. My heart pounded in my chest, my stomach twisting with a mix of nerves and anticipation. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the way his hand tightened around mine as we walked. The tension between us was palpable, a thick, electric current that crackled in the air. When we reached the bathroom, I stepped inside, the steam from the shower already beginning to fill the room. I turned to face him, my back pressed against the cool tile as I looked up into his eyes. He hesitated for just a moment, his hands still gripping mine, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. But then, as if the dam had finally broken, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He stood a few steps away, still fully dressed, his shirt and pants clinging to him awkwardly in the humid air. His eyes were locked on me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The tension in his posture was unmistakable, and I could feel the weight of his gaze as it traveled over me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The awkwardness was palpable, the kind that made me second-guess every decision that had led us here. But then, as if drawn by some invisible force, I stepped closer to him, my fingers trembling slightly as I reached for the hem of his shirt. He didn't stop me. His breath hitched as I pulled it up and over his head, letting it fall to the floor. His chest was smooth and damp from the steam, and I traced a hand down his torso, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm. The water cascaded over us as we stepped under the showerhead, soothing and electrifying all at once. My skin tingled as it made contact, the droplets sliding down my body in rivulets. I kept my eyes on his, searching for something, reassurance, maybe, or permission. His expression was unreadable, a mix of desire, fear, and uncertainty that mirrored my own. I reached out to touch his chest, my palm flattening against his damp skin. His heartbeat was wild, thundering beneath my hand, and I felt a shiver run through him at the contact. We stood like that for what felt like forever, the water washing away the last bits of hesitation. Slowly, the space between us disappeared, our bodies moving closer until there was nothing but heat and steam separating us. My hands slid up to his shoulders, my fingers tracing the curve of his muscles, and I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me tight against him. The first kiss was hesitant, almost shy, like neither of us was sure how far to go. But as our lips met, something shifted. The awkwardness melted away, replaced by a hunger neither of us could ignore. His mouth moved against mine with growing urgency, his hands sliding down to grip my waist as he deepened the kiss. The feeling was intoxicating, the heat of his body against mine sent sparks shooting through me. I kissed him back just as fiercely, my fingers tangling in his wet hair as I pressed myself closer. The steam swirled around us, making the moment even more intense, and for a second, I let myself forget everything else, who we were, what this meant, the consequences. In that moment, it was just us, lost in the heat of the water and the connection between us. But then, as our kiss deepened, I felt something hard pressing against my stomach. My breath caught, and instinctively, I pulled back, my eyes widening as I glanced down. My stomach dropped when I saw him. His size was more than I'd expected, and the realization hit me like a bucket of cold water. My heart raced, but this time it wasn't desire, it was panic. "We can't," I muttered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My voice was shaky, barely audible over the sound of the shower, but the weight of what I'd said hung heavy in the air. I stepped back, putting distance between us, and saw the confusion and frustration flash across his face. Before he could say anything, I turned and stepped out of the shower, grabbing a towel and wrapping it around myself in one quick motion. My mind was spinning, guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't name. I didn't look back as I fled the bathroom, leaving him standing there under the water, dazed and alone. The hallway was cold compared to the warmth of the bathroom, and I shivered as I hurried to my room. My thoughts were a mess, my heart still pounding. I knew I'd crossed a line, pushed things further than they should have gone. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a mistake that would change everything. The days after I left Ethan standing in the shower were filled with a weird mix of guilt and longing. I told myself it was for the best, that we couldn't keep crossing boundaries like this, that it was wrong, dangerous, reckless. But the memory of his touch, the heat between us, lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. I avoided him at first, keeping busy with work and chores, but it was impossible to ignore the tension that still crackled between us whenever we crossed paths. Eventually, it was Ethan who broke the silence. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, he walked in, his hands shoved in his pockets and his shoulders tense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but steady. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, but I nodded and followed him to the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling way too big. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he broke the silence. "I don't want to pretend like nothing happened," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "I know it's complicated, but I can't just act like I don't feel this way." I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him we couldn't, that it was wrong, but the words died on my lips. The truth was, I couldn't pretend either. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. I sighed, running a hand through my hair as I struggled to find the right words. "I don't know what we're doing," I admitted finally. "But I can't stop thinking about it either." And so, somehow, we found ourselves in the shower together again, not out of impulsiveness this time, but out of a shared, unspoken need to explore whatever this was between us. The warm water cascaded over our bodies, washing away the initial awkwardness and leaving behind a growing comfort that let us be vulnerable with each other. At first, we stood silently, unsure how to start, but slowly, the tension began to ease, replaced by a sense of connection that felt both thrilling and terrifying. My eyes drifted downward, and I couldn't help but smirk. "No wonder you were so shy," I said, my voice light but laced with amusement. "You've been hiding something impressive." His face turned bright red, and he let out a nervous chuckle, his hands instinctively moving to cover himself. "Shut up," he muttered, though there was a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I laughed, the sound echoing softly in the steamy room. "Relax," I said, stepping closer to him. "You don't have to be embarrassed. It's just us here." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly as he looked at me, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. I reached for his hands, gently pulling them away from his body and guiding them to my waist. "Here," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "Let me show you." I moved his hand slowly over my skin, teaching him how to touch me in a way that made my breath catch. His fingers were tentative at first, but as he grew more confident, his movements became bolder, more deliberate. I guided his hands over my shoulders, down my back, and along my hips, my own hands resting lightly on his as I showed him what felt good. The intimacy of it was overwhelming, the way his touch sent shivers through me, but it was also strangely comforting. As the days passed, our showers became more than just physical encounters. They became a space where we could talk openly, where the steam and the water seemed to wash away our inhibitions. One evening, as we stood together under the spray, I leaned against his chest, my back pressed against his warmth, his arms wrapped around me, his chin resting on my shoulder as the water cascaded over us. "Do you ever think about what we're doing?" I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper. He tensed for a moment, his grip tightening slightly around me. "All the time," he admitted, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "It's all I can think about." I turned in his arms, looking up at him with a mix of guilt and curiosity. "Do you ever feel like we're making a mistake?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find the right words. "I don't know," he said finally. "It doesn't feel like a mistake when I'm with you. But I know it's complicated." I nodded, my heart aching with the truth of his words. It was complicated, more than I wanted to admit. But in that moment, with his arms around me and the water washing away my doubts, it was hard to care about anything else. We talked about other things too, our dreams, our fears, the things we'd never told anyone else. The shower became a space where we could be honest with each other, where the walls we'd built around ourselves seemed to crumble under the weight of the steam and the warmth. I learned things about him I'd never known before, his insecurities, his hopes for the future, the way he saw the world. And in turn, I shared parts of myself I'd kept hidden for so long. One evening, as we rinsed the soap from our bodies, I turned to him with a playful smile. "You're getting pretty good at this," I teased, my fingers trailing lightly over his arms. "I might have to keep you around." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and I felt a pang of affection for him I hadn't expected. "I think I'd like that," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. As the days turned into weeks, our intimacy grew. Each encounter deepened the connection between us. There were moments of laughter, like when I accidentally dropped the soap and he insisted on picking it up for me, his face turning red as I teased him about it. And there were moments of quiet intensity, like when he'd hold me close, his breath warm against my skin as we stood under the water together. But even as we grew closer, the weight of what we were doing hung over us, a silent reminder of the risks we were taking. We didn't talk about it often, but it was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. And as much as I tried to push it away, I knew that sooner or later, we'd have to face the consequences of our actions. The evening sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow through the bathroom window. I stood in front of the mirror, still wrapped in a towel, the steam from the shower clinging to the air and fogging the glass. The warm water had done its job, leaving my skin flushed and my muscles relaxed, but my mind was anything but calm. The events of the past few weeks, our secret encounters, the growing intimacy, the unspoken tension, had left me feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. I ran a brush through my damp hair, the rhythmic motion soothing in its familiarity. My reflection in the mirror was hazy, the steam blurring the edges, but I could see the faint flush on my cheeks, the way my eyes sparkled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. Every time we stepped into the shower together, it felt like we were crossing a line we could never uncross. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Neither could he. The towel clung to my body, the soft fabric still damp from the shower. I tilted my head to the side, brushing out the tangles in my hair, my movements slow and absent-minded. My thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan, the way his hands had felt on my skin under the warm spray, the intensity in his eyes, the way his breath had hitched when I teased him. It was impossible to ignore the pull between us, the way it seemed to grow stronger with every encounter. I didn't hear him enter the bathroom, but I felt him before I saw him, a sudden warmth pressed against my back, his hands resting lightly on my hips, his breath soft and warm against my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. And I could feel the evidence of his arousal pressing against me through the towel. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze for a moment, the brush stilling in my hand. I glanced at him in the mirror, our eyes meeting in the fogged glass. His gaze was dark and intense, filled with a hunger that mirrored my own. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as I turned to face him. I let the brush fall onto the counter, my hands instinctively reaching for him. His eyes searched mine, as if asking for permission, and I could see the conflict in them, the desire warring with his guilt. Without thinking, I reached up to cup his face with one hand, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He leaned into my touch, his hands tightening on my hips as he pulled me closer. And then, without a word, I kissed him. It was deep and consuming, the kind of kiss that left no room for doubt or hesitation. His lips moved against mine with a desperate urgency, his hands sliding up my back to pull me even closer. I tangled my fingers in his damp hair, my body pressing against his. The tension between us built to an almost unbearable level. Our hands explored each other's bodies with a mix of curiosity and need. The barriers of the towels were quickly forgotten. His touch was hesitant at first, as if he was still afraid to cross that final line, but I guided him, showing him with my actions that it was okay, that I wanted this just as much as he did. My hands traveled over his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm. And I could feel the way his breath hitched whenever my fingers brushed against his skin. The air in the bathroom was thick with steam and desire, the sound of our breathing mingling with the soft hum of the fan. It was slow and intimate, every touch deliberate and filled with meaning. I could feel the tension building between us, the need to be closer, to cross that final line, becoming almost unbearable. And then, finally, we gave into it. Our movements became more urgent, the barriers between us disappearing completely as we surrendered to the heat and the intensity of the moment. It was a blur of sensations, his hands on my skin, the weight of his body against mine, the way he whispered my name like it was the only word he knew. When it was over, we stood there, our bodies pressed together, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The steam still clung to the air, wrapping around us like a blanket, and I could feel his heartbeat echoing against my chest. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, holding each other, the weight of what we'd done settling over us like a heavy blanket. I looked up at him, my eyes searching his for some kind of reassurance or understanding. His expression was unreadable, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place, but I could see the way his hands trembled as they rested on my hips. I reached up to brush a strand of damp hair from his face, my fingers lingering against his cheek as I tried to find the words to say. But in the end, I didn't need to say anything. He leaned down and kissed me again, this time slow and tender. And I knew that, for better or worse, this was where we were now. There was no going back, no pretending that this hadn't happened. And as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for us. What it would mean for everything. The evening air was warm, the soft hum of the kitchen fan blending with the clatter of dishes as we prepared dinner. The earlier intensity of the bathroom had faded into a comfortable playfulness, the kind that made it easy to forget the weight of what we'd done. Ethan stood at the counter, chopping vegetables with more focus than the task required, while I leaned against the fridge, sipping a glass of wine and watching him with a sly smile. "You know," I began, my voice light and teasing, "if you keep chopping those veggies like that, we might actually have a decent meal for once." He glanced up at me, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Careful," he said, his tone matching mine. "I might just start expecting compliments every time I cook." I laughed, the sound warm and easy, and for a moment, it felt like we were just two people sharing a quiet evening together. But beneath the surface, the tension still lingered, a reminder that nothing about this was simple. "You're surprisingly good at that," I said, my tone light but teasing. "Is there anything you can't do?" He glanced up at me, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Depends on what you're asking," he replied, his voice warm with amusement. I laughed, setting my glass down on the counter and moving closer to him. "Well, you've definitely got the whole kitchen skills thing down," I said, leaning in to inspect his work. "But I'm still trying to figure out how you managed to hide that for so long." His face turned red, and he let out a nervous chuckle, his hands pausing mid-chop. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" he muttered, though there was no real annoyance in his voice. I grinned, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "Not a chance," I said, my voice dropping slightly. "It's kind of hard to forget." He laughed, shaking his head, but I could see the way his eyes darkened as they lingered on mine. The air between us shifted, the teasing giving way to something deeper, something that made my stomach flutter. I stepped closer, my hand resting lightly on his arm, and I felt the muscles tense beneath my touch. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "All the time," he admitted, his voice low and heavy with emotion. "It's all I can think about." His words sent a shiver through me, and I leaned in closer, our lips just inches apart. The tension between us was almost unbearable, a thick, electric current that crackled in the air. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine. For a moment, we just stood there, our breaths mingling, the world outside the kitchen fading away. Then, without warning, he picked me up and set me on the kitchen table, the dishes clattering as they were pushed aside. My heart raced, and I laughed breathlessly, my hands gripping his shoulders as he stepped between my legs. Our kisses grew more urgent, more passionate, the earlier playfulness giving way to something raw and unbridled. His hands moved over my body with a desperate need, and I could feel the way his touch sent sparks shooting through me. The tension between us was overwhelming, the heat building with each passing second. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as I kissed him with a hunger I hadn't known I was capable of. We were lost in the moment, the world outside the kitchen forgotten, until the sound of the door opening shattered the silence. We froze, our bodies still pressed together, as the weight of the moment came crashing down. I turned my head toward the door, my heart leaping into my throat as I saw my husband, his father, standing there, his eyes wide with shock. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension as he took in the scene before him. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I slowly pulled away from Ethan. He stepped back, his face pale and his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. My husband's gaze flickered between us, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The silence stretched on forever, until finally, he broke it, his voice low and heavy with emotion. What the hell is going on here? The kitchen, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, the weight of my husband's fury pressing down on us like a storm about to break. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, his eyes darting between Ethan and me. The silence between us was suffocating, hanging heavy in the air like a thick fog. Every second felt like an eternity, broken only by the deafening rush of my own heartbeat pounding furiously in my ears. The tension was so thick it felt almost tangible, as if the very room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. What the hell is going on here? My husband repeated, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. The words cut through the silence like a sharp blade, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. My chest tightened, and my stomach churned. I felt the ground shift beneath me as I instinctively stepped back from the table, my legs unsteady, struggling to keep me upright. I grabbed the edge of the table for support, my fingers digging into the wood as if I could somehow anchor myself in that moment, in that awful, suffocating stillness. Ethan, standing frozen beside me, was a mirror of shock and disbelief. His face was ashen, drained of color, and his hands were balled into tight fists at his sides, shaking ever so slightly. Neither of us spoke, as if the enormity of what had just unfolded between us, in front of him, had rendered us mute, unable to form any coherent thoughts. All we could do was stand there, trapped in the weight of the situation. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the room as my husband moved further into the space. Each step seemed deliberate, measured, as if he was trying to regain control of the situation, or perhaps to keep himself from shattering in front of us. The anger in his eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else there too, a deeper, more painful emotion that twisted my insides. It was betrayal, raw and unrelenting, and it cut through me like a knife. The guilt that flooded my chest was almost suffocating, and I couldn't stop the way my breath caught in my throat. Answer me, his voice broke through the tension, sharp and demanding, rising with each word. What the hell were you two doing? I opened my mouth, desperate to say something, anything, that could make sense of what had just happened. But no words came out. What could I possibly say in this moment? How could I explain the unexplainable? My mind raced in a frantic scramble, searching for some way to fix this, some shred of an explanation that could ease the pain. But there was nothing. There was only the crushing weight of guilt and the harsh realization that we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. It was done, and nothing I could say would change that. It was Ethan who finally broke the silence, his voice trembling with uncertainty, the words coming out in a hesitant rush. Dad, it's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like, my husband repeated, his voice thick with disbelief, almost as though he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. His words were laced with a bitter edge, and he let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head in frustration as his eyes locked onto our son. Do you really think I'm that naive? I saw everything, clearly. Don't lie to me, Ethan. The accusation hit like a slap, and I could see the hurt flash across Ethan's face. He looked at his father, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and helplessness, before he opened his mouth to speak. But before any words could form, he closed it again, his shoulders slumping in defeat. It was as if the weight of the situation had crushed him, leaving him without a way to fix this, to explain away the mess we had made. There was no getting around it. We had made a decision, one that was reckless and selfish, and now we were paying the price. My husband turned to face me then, his gaze sharp, almost accusatory. And you, he said, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. His eyes were wide with hurt and anger, and I could hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. What were you thinking? How could you betray me like this? How could you do this to us? I felt my stomach churn at his words, and I couldn't help but flinch. The tears were already stinging my eyes, threatening to spill over. There was nothing I could say that would take back the hurt, nothing I could do to undo what had already been done. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely a breath, the words falling from my lips like a feeble attempt to soothe the damage. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Not supposed to happen like this, he echoed, his voice rising again, the fury in it unmistakable. What exactly did you think was supposed to happen? Were you just going to keep this from me? Keep lying to my face, hoping I'd never find out? The sting of his words cut deep, and I felt a fresh rush of guilt flood through me. He was right. I had lied to him, had kept secrets, had broken the trust that was supposed to bind us. I couldn't even justify it anymore, not to him, not to myself. The truth was, I had known all along that what we were doing was wrong, that I was betraying him in the worst possible way. "I don't know what to say," I admitted softly, my voice quivering as I struggled to keep it together. "I never wanted to hurt you. That was never the intention." "But you did," he said, his voice colder now, as if the last remnants of emotion had frozen over. His words were sharp, cutting, and final. "You both did. And there's no undoing that." The room fell silent once again, the weight of Ryan's words pressing down on us like an invisible force. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating us with the unbearable tension. I could feel the heat of the tears sliding down my cheeks, but I made no effort to wipe them away. They felt like they belonged there, like they were the only honest thing in a situation that had become so painfully complicated. Ethan stood beside me, his tall frame hunched with guilt, his head lowered in a gesture of defeat. The shame was written all over his face, as if the very sight of it would somehow absolve him of the hurt we'd caused. But it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. My husband's gaze shifted between Ethan and me, his anger slowly morphing into something far more difficult to face, a deep, aching sadness that seemed to carry the weight of years. His eyes, once so full of fire and fury, now seemed hollow with loss. It was a look that cut deeper than any sharp words he might have spoken. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute, piercing the silence that had enveloped us. "Get out," he said, his words firm but edged with quiet sorrow. "Both of you. I can't even look at you right now." I nodded silently, my heart pounding in my chest as my legs wobbled beneath me. I moved away from the table, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the weight of my actions was physically anchoring me to the ground. Ethan lingered for a moment, his eyes catching his father's in a fleeting, wordless exchange, but he didn't speak. The tension in the room had already spoken for us all. Without another word, Ethan followed me out of the kitchen, the sound of our footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway. The silence between us was thick with unspoken thoughts. We were both lost in our own labyrinth of guilt and fear, neither of us willing or able to break the suffocating quiet. My mind spun in a frantic whirlwind of emotions, regret for what we had done, sorrow for the family we had torn apart, and a deep, aching longing that refused to be silenced. I kept replaying the moments, the stolen glances, the quiet moments of connection, wondering if they had truly been worth the destruction they had left in their wake. The question nagged at me relentlessly, and yet I couldn't find an answer that offered any comfort. The uncertainty was a terrifying companion, one that seemed to haunt me more than the anger or the betrayal. I didn't know if what had transpired could ever be forgiven, if what had once been a source of secret joy could ever be redeemed. The thought of losing everything, of walking away from the only man I had ever truly loved, was an agony I couldn't bear to imagine. Ethan stopped suddenly in front of his room, his hand resting lightly on the doorknob, as if bracing himself for what was to come. He turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. There was so much in them, so much pain, so much regret, but also something else. A flicker of something softer, something vulnerable. A hint of the person I had once known and loved so completely. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry. And for the first time, I didn't know whether he was apologizing to me, to his father, or to himself. But it didn't matter. All I could do was nod in response, my heart breaking in ways I didn't think it was possible to break. "Me too," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, nearly breaking as I spoke. My words were barely audible as the weight of everything crashed down on me. He opened his mouth, likely to say something more, but then his words faltered. His body seemed to lose all its strength, and he slumped forward, his shoulders sagging in defeat. He shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't find the right thing to say either. Without another word, he turned and walked into his room, closing the door gently behind him, leaving me standing there in the cold, empty hallway. The silence that followed was suffocating, and the house felt eerily still, as though time itself had frozen in place. The quiet pressed down on me, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air like an oppressive fog. The choices we had made, the words we had said, the moments we couldn't take back, everything seemed to settle over me, a heavy, unbearable burden. I had no idea what the future would look like now, how we would ever move forward, or what we could possibly do to fix the irreparable damage we'd caused. The consequences of our actions were still unfolding, rippling outward in ways I couldn't fully understand yet. But I knew it would be a long time before any of us truly healed. As I stood there, my face streaked with tears, it hit me with full force. Nothing would ever be the same. No matter how much I wanted to go back, to undo everything that had led us to this moment, I knew deep down that it was impossible. Time couldn't be rewound, and the mistakes we had made couldn't be erased. All we had now was the painful truth, and the only thing left was to face the fallout, to somehow navigate through the wreckage we'd left behind. I turned to leave, my heart heavy with regret and uncertainty. The future was too blurry to make sense of, but one thing was clear: we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As I walked away, my thoughts consumed me with the question that had no answer: would we ever truly recover from the devastation we had caused, or would the scars we'd inflicted be too deep to heal? The story may have ended in that moment, but the consequences would linger long after, unresolved, haunting us with their weight.